Yeah, we can go.
All right. Three, two, one.
Welcome, everybody, to Secondhand News brought to you by PPR. This is a new podcast simply talking about F1 news, crazy things happening in the world, and things that are happening in Formula One, of course. So, to start off, let me introduce myself. This is Nathan Hewitt, better known as IB Na on PPR Esports on our YouTube channel. I'm joined tonight by James Trotter and Austin Javerick. Um, we are going to be just talking about some interesting topics tonight. James, how are you doing tonight?
IB, I got very few complaints, my man. It's been the first kind of interesting week we've had in a while because of the pandemic. So it's nice that we kind of got a couple of morsels of news thrown our way, and we can actually talk about something besides hypotheticals.
Oh, absolutely. Austin, what about you? How are you doing tonight, man?
Very excited. I'm with James. It's the first time we've had real news to actually talk about in a long time, and it's seeming more like a silly season, but it's way better than what we had.
Absolutely. And it's so great to finally get some true F1 news. It's a little weird, to have so much silliness without the season actually starting. We're kind of in uncharted territories, of course, here. But Austin, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your F1 history and let's get a little bit about you.
So, of course, my name's Austin Javerick, and I am a relative newcomer to F1. My foyer into the sport was Drive to Survive Season 1. As most people, know that that was a very big drop in the bucket for people outside the F1 sphere. Before that, I had always known F1 kind of existed, but never really paid too much attention to it. I maybe catch the half end of a race here or see Lewis Hamilton on the front page there. But then once Drive to Survive came out, I really started picking up on some of the more technicalities of the sport and what made it interesting and the strategy. And I think that's really what has made me stick with it is the strategy of the teams, the drivers, the tires, the car, you name it. I'm really excited to be starting this podcast and getting the opportunity to talk about that. Every week or every other week, and yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. And I'm right there with you. There is so much drama in the sport and there's so much very technical stuff. James, what about you? Tell us a little bit about your F1 history.
Well, that's funny. Funny that Kermit should say that. I'm in almost exactly the same boat. I've pretty much only been into your typical, NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, any sport you're probably more familiar with growing up in the United States. So Formula One was always kind of this thing that happened overseas that I knew about. I'd heard of Michael Schumacher. I didn't even know like what he was famous for. I didn't even know what an F1 car looked like until I had an idea in my head, but like until I saw the Netflix doc, these were all strangers to me, and they were kind of people that Jeremy Clarkson had joked about in passing on Top Gear, and they used to be jokes that just flew over my head. And now, after taking the dive and one Fanatec purchase later, 2 copies of the game, and now I'm the co-owner of PPR Esports. So we've come a long way. We've kind of come full circle. I'm as deep in it as you can possibly get.
Absolutely. And guys, just for a little bit about myself, I have been following F1 probably since the early 2000s. I was very young, seeing my first race sometime in between 97 and 99. And I fell in love with the red car, the Scuderia. And that could be partially because of my Italian heritage. That could be because Michael Schumacher was just an artist behind the wheel, and watching him drive, regardless of whether it was on TV or not, it was just poetic in some ways. Um, Very huge Michael fan, very huge Ferrari fan, and that's honestly just never changed for me. At this point, I have been to a couple of races. As James, I have good word that you've been to a race as well.
I have. I had the privilege of being at Monza for Ferrari's first win since Fernando won. So, gotta say, really topped the charts as far as the sporting events goes.
That's absolutely amazing. I'm very jealous. Obviously, Monza, Ferrari, home, Italy. Um, could be my Italian heritage that makes me want to go so bad, but love the team. Uh, Went to the 2018 and 2019 United States Grand Prix at Circuit of the Americas down in Austin. I got to see Kimi Raikkonen's first win after an eternity, what seems like, for the Scuderia. um, and it's just it was a really awesome event for me. But let's break on. Let's get into some news. We've got a lot of interesting things happening this week in Formula One. Let's get your take on it, guys. I kind of want your opinion. I want you guys to bounce back and let's get some different points of view and perspective in here. So what do we think about Ferrari and Sebastian Vettel and how things are going to end up there?
Well, I guess I'll just lead us off. It's the top of the run sheet. Go figure. So you guys actually, I would say Nate probably knows better than Kermit or myself, but you've been on the Sebastian Vettel at Ferrari dream team situation for what, it's been like 5 years now. He's been at this trying to win the title.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So my understanding has been he's had basically two really close shaves with it in 17 and in 18. And both campaigns, there was kind of like an inflection point where he just was never the same. So 17, I think it was Singapore, and then in 18 it was Hockenheim when he went off, an unforced error, as it were, right at the hairpin in Hockenheim.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to me that in 2019, I guess that was supposedly going to be like, this was the year Ferrari's going to challenge. They were fastest in testing, yada yada yada. And they got blown out of the water. I think it was all the way up through Barcelona. Mercedes was taking 1-2s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that him bringing on not having Kimmy anymore, it posed a challenge for him.
What do you think, Kermit?
Yeah, I think Charles Leclerc stepping into the sport really shook it up for Sebastian Vettel. And while I haven't, I didn't watch the older seasons live, I have watched quite a few just different documentaries, pieces put together here, and watched some of the races about his time at Red Bull. And there's something about him in that era that just seems so energetic, seems so ready to win and hungry for a win that I just haven't seen him have recently, from 2017 on.
Maybe that's a knock-on effect of just being a Ferrari driver. I guess when you're at Red Bull, there's pressure too, but it's weird because Red Bull, to me, it's like, yeah, you're racing for the team and you're racing for Helmut Marko, and your job is to deliver results for the name of an energy drink. But racing for a Ferrari, you're delivering results for at the behest of an entire country. Yeah,
There's a lot more pressure.
It's like Ferrari is Italian, Italy, their biggest export is Ferrari, I think.
So, I read an article. Obviously, we all know the news now that Seb is officially left Ferrari, and I read an article that actually said, Seb maybe missed the clinical cleanliness and the cutthroat style that the Brits have at Red Bull versus the Ferrari that's driven very passionately. Everybody knows that Ferrari is a very passionate company and they sell road cars to go racing. They don't sell road cars, or they don't go racing to sell the road cars. They're very different from a lot of other teams on the field. And I think that that's part of maybe Seb couldn't deal with the passion too much. Maybe he needs that little bit more structure that a British team offers.
Well, isn't he considered to be like the Tifosi, like base Captain Tifosi? Like, he grew up a Schumacher fan. All he wanted to do was drive for Ferrari. He's always screaming in Italian over the radio.
Oh, absolutely. He has pictures with Schumacher and stuff, and met Schumacher in his upbringing years. So he's definitely a Ferrari fan through and through, but he's not a performer. He doesn't have the same passion, I don't think, after being trimmed and pruned by a team like Red Bull.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that he just doesn't seem to, it's not go get him anymore. You don't see Seb saying too much in the press conferences. It seems like, at least from that era, he went from being one of the most, maybe not the most, but a more vocal driver on the grid and ready, headstrong, to now in news conferences you take a back seat, kind of doesn't talk as loud as some of the other drivers, isn't really on social media or anything like that. So it seems like moving to the team for him, whether it's the team or him, I'm not sure, but it's something's definitely changed, I think, during his time at Ferrari. I don't know if it is. Do you think he just got to the top and decided he could coast from there because he's in one of the top cars?
I For me, I think it's that he wanted to get to Ferrari obviously because of the money. And Ferrari's desperate for a championship win and a constructor championship,
An
and they're
understatement to say
nowhere
the
close
least.
to it. It's definitely an understatement, but I mean they're desperate for it. And Vettel was the first person that they could purchase and saw that chance with, and that's what they tried doing. They didn't have we didn't have as many young drivers as we have in the sport right now. We had some older drivers, and we definitely had some less talented drivers at the time when Vettel went to Ferrari. And I think that that's really part of the struggle is that he went there, he had this hope, Ferrari had this faith in him, and he's made rookie mistakes all throughout his time with Ferrari. I mean, I thought he was teaching spin classes between Monza, Coda, and Japan.
Man,
Uh,
why you got to do him? Kick a man when he's down, Nathan?
There's classes. I mean, come on.
No, you're right though. You're absolutely right. And I will say this: there was kind of an underlying message with the entire the divorce, as it were, that's kind of been
Mhm.
played out in the media right now. Um, it keeps coming back to the fact that whenever any statement Ferrari's made, they've basically come out and said as much as this was a difficult decision by both parties, and we feel that neither of us are going to get. Basically, there's no way forward beyond 2020. They both mutually felt that way, and I'm sure if any of you guys have ever been through a nasty breakup or a sad breakup, maybe is a better way to put, not a nasty one, but a sad breakup, where you kind of like you look at the other partner and you kind of think to yourself like, where does this go from here? Is there a tomorrow to this? Is it really going to make sense to continue prolonging this? Especially when they've basically swapped out the old wife for like the young hot piece of ass that's Charles.
And I mean, Charles is that, right? I mean, God, I love the kid at Sauber. I truly did. And I think that he let Ferrari get to his head last year. Obviously, he wanted to go to Ferrari because him and Jules Bianchi, rest in peace, they grew up together, they raced together. And it was a promise that they had to each other to get to Ferrari. And that's why Charles had that drive to get to Ferrari so much. But then last year, there was just so much tension in the team. And we really saw Charles break down at Monaco, where he destroyed the car. I
after
mean, he was
yeah,
driving like a pissed off teenager,
after
right?
being on the receiving
yeah.
end of some very poor management decisions thus far.
I'm gonna leave that out because Vettel was the number one driver technically,
I
even though I totally agree with you.
but I mean, like the writing was on the wall at Bahrain and Shanghai, and then like there was the Baku incident when he hit the wall in qualifying. Like,
I'm stupid.
yeah, but like it seemed like there was so much momentum gathering for our young spry Monegasque that Vettel could. I mean, I'm sure because he said it himself in interviews before. He doesn't do the mind game thing, which I think is just a flat out lie. But he says he doesn't. But he definitely could feel the power base slipping through his fingers, essentially. Like
He lost control of his team for
totally.
sure.
I mean, it was no longer Vettel's championship campaign. It was, oh, here's the bright young pupil.
And absolutely.
Going back to what you were talking about, when they picked him up, they were hoping he would be someone they could build a team around.
Yes.
And when he's not in that role anymore. But kind of going to that, and Nathan, you might have a different opinion on this because you've been in the sport longer. But the whole concept of like a number one and a number two driver kind of seems kind of unnecessary, and two like a luxury that you can really only afford to do that if you're literally Mercedes and you can call all the shots.
But Mercedes dealt with the challenge, right? They had Nico Rosberg there for a long time, and Nico pushed every single season until he finally won it in 2016. And we don't see that from Valtteri, and we don't see that.
Oh yeah.
And
It's Valtteri's not
it
even
was
half the
always
driver Nico was.
no, and it's always looking out for the team's best interest. But this comes into beautifully. Sainz is going to fill the Ferrari seat. Is Sainz? James, I know you're really upset about this. We're breaking up the Lando Carlos.
You guys
You
do,
know,
yeah. You guys give your takes. I'll hop in at the end. I'll hop in.
I absolutely. And Austin, I want you to take away on this. What do you think about the Sainz and Leclerc team up? What do you think about Ferrari? What do you think about how they're going to handle these very high caliber drivers?
Honestly, I am a little bit of a loss as to what to expect because Charles, he was extremely strong uh, at Ferrari and he was strong at Sauber, but I think for the most part he's largely unproven to say the least. I mean, I think over half a season of outperforming your teammate, even though he is Sebastian Vettel, doesn't necessarily make you the best driver on the grid. I think Sainz is a nice complementary decision. As far as maybe age, kind of maybe a way to hedge your bet. As far as they don't necessarily want to go all in on Charles Leclerc and build the team entirely around him. They want someone else that they can form and they can shape and they can basically bring into the Ferrari mindset. I think part of what worries me about that is are they staking their futures on too young a drivers, right? Are we going with a Red Bull Toro Rosso situation where we're bringing up drivers that maybe aren't ready for it? Yeah, well, I don't know. I shouldn't say that because both Sainz and Charles have been extremely consistent and both done very well. So I think they out of the two younger drivers they could have picked, I think they're two of the stronger drivers to move your team forward with. However, I think with the structure of Ferrari, I might have liked to see an older driver come in that's able to offer some of that direction to Charles and challenge him at the same time. I mean, I'm also a big Ricardo fan, but we'll get to him later.
So I want to ask you, who would you have put in the seat then out of the current F1 grid? Or, there's always talk of Fernando. Would you have brought Fernando back into the sport and put him at the Scuderia, even after their hard relationship that they already had and his history with Lewis, obviously back, in 2008, where McLaren fell apart with that partnership?
Well, right. So since I've only seen a few races of Fernando Alonso's. I'm not necessarily on the hype train that a lot of people that have followed him throughout his career are. To me, it seems like there's more controversy floating around him and why he can't go to certain teams than there are teams he can go to. That
I
it
can definitely agree with that. So who would
right?
you put in the seat?
Who would I put in that seat? So that seat, if I wanted a driver that was maybe going to give him a little more support, Kimi's obviously not an option. He just left. Ferrari wouldn't do that. Vettel's going. Ricardo, I think, was honestly a really strong option. I think Ricardo is at his peak, if not getting to his peak, and could be a really strong motivator for Charles.
Hmm. I can definitely see that there. Um, James, go ahead. I know
Okay.
you've got a lot to say about this.
Let me clear my throat real quick. All right. So, look, let me break this down step by step. I'm mad for a couple different reasons, but I'm gonna start with the very first one, being that I'm embarrassed. I've been let down. To
Jeez.
quote Stephen A., I have been led astray, run amok, disillusioned, hoodwinked,
Whoa.
whatever. All the words in the dictionary would sum up how I feel about this. Now, you might be sitting at home asking yourself, why is this guy from California so mad about a Spanish guy's decision to go to a red car? Let me tell you why. Basically, the way I had seen things up until literally today, and I've stewed on this today, and I've come around to it now, but beforehand, I really didn't see why a guy like Carlos, who had been politically, depending on how you look at it, he was kind of politically maneuvered out of Red Bull because of Verstappen. He got screwed at Renault because of the Ricardo move, and if Will Buxton said it himself in Drive to Survive, the Carlos move to McLaren was a massive gamble because if McLaren hadn't gotten it right last year, it was going to be like they were going to start slipping farther and farther back, kind of going the way of Williams maybe. But instead, they got it together. They got Andreas Seidel. They're getting the Mercedes engines back. It seemed to me like McLaren was a team that was just beginning to finally right the ship and point itself in the right direction. And I have this on the public record that I said that Carlos Sainz would challenge for a world title in a McLaren. So talk about a freezing cold take. Not great. I have that on the public record. I got to eat crow today. But then I thought about it. I took a second. I took a deep breath. Don't be mad. There's a reason for this. And I thought about it from Ferrari's perspective, not from Carlos's perspective. Ferrari doesn't just want a number 2. They don't want to have to pay someone who's already won a Grand Prix, because there's a difference. Just like in any sport, the minute you win a championship or you're like the MVP, you then are worth your market value is like through the roof. A guy like Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant are going to cost more on paper than a guy like Damian Lillard because they've got the MVP accolades. Comparing that to F1, a guy like Ricciardo was probably never going to go to Ferrari on the basis that they were going to have to pay him what the market value had been set at by Renault, which was not cheap. I looked it up today just to reaffirm how bad that situation was handled by Cyril. They paid him $78 million on a 2-year contract. $78 million. Now, I'm not an accountant or a finance expert, but that's a pretty large pile of cash. Wouldn't you say so, fellas?
Oh yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
I could live the rest of my life on that.
Yeah. Well, you could retire at 30. The point
Yeah,
is,
but don't you think Daniel Ricciardo too? And if he got a chance to drive at the famed Ferrari, he'd jump at the chance, even if they offered him half.
here's my next thing. Here's my next thing. I think he was already in consideration, but just like anyone right now in the current economic climate, I hadn't considered the coronavirus, even though I'm living through it. No one's selling a lot of cars right now, especially not luxury cars. McLaren already announced today they have to put their own F1 car collection up as collateral, just like Williams has. You know, in situations not great. You can't afford to be shilling out that money on just a one test driver, essentially, is what he'd be. He'd be a test driver for a project car they race. You can get Carlos Sainz in there because he's never won a Grand Prix. He just cracked basically the top 5 in the driver standings last year. I know he finished 6th, but let's just call it 5th because that's pretty much what it was. He was the best of the rest by a country mile. You can pay him 25% of Ricciardo's salary and conceivably get the same amount of performance out of him. And I'm sure Carlos had a conversation with his father, who's a motorsport icon in Europe, and I'm sure his dad sat him down and said, look, you can stay at McLaren. It's your team. They want you. They want to see you succeed. But there's no guarantees. But if you go to Ferrari and you play your cards right, this might be your only shot at the top. And I really think that was what it was. It's like, this is the sure thing. This is the big paycheck. This is what is going to put me from being, like, 2 years ago, he was just a midfield driver at Renault who was there on loan. Now he's a Ferrari driver. In a matter of 18 months, he's completely readjusted the trajectory of his career, and it actually, I'm so mad at myself, it makes the most sense that he's going to take his shot now. Charles Leclerc or not, he wants a shot at the throne, and this is the best way he's going to do that.
So that brings up a great point there. You know, Ferrari couldn't deal with Vettel and Leclerc properly. They couldn't manage them, right? And that's because they didn't view their drivers as equals like Mercedes has for so long. You know, you're an equal until one of you is actually genuinely leading the championship at a sufficient pace, right? And you know, you have to always do what's best for the team. Ferrari can't function that way very well. I mean, you know, we saw in the early 2000s with Michael and Barrichello. They literally gave team orders at Austria 2 years in a row at the A1 ring, or what's known now as the Red Bull ring. You know, last lap, straight away, Barrichello's leading, and he backs off and lets Michael go by. And they say it's for the championship, and they're only 6 races into the season. So Ferrari has lost that, obviously, because we don't have Ross Brawn there. We don't have Jean Todt. You know, we have a whole new generation of management there, and they already struggled with Seb and Leclerc. What are they going to do with Sainz and Leclerc? Because I don't have a feeling that Sainz is going to settle for second. I really think that he is going to fight, much like we saw Nico with Hamilton.
Yeah, I agree with that. We haven't heard as to whether one of them is given higher status or not, right? That's not released yet, or will it ever?
Well, I think it's going to come down to how much they're paying and how long Carlos is supposed to be there, because they got Charles on basically what's the sweetheart deal. They put a ring on it. He's going to be there for till 2024.
That's
Um,
true.
I don't know what Carlos's deal is. I don't know if I can try to look it up right now, but I don't think that information's been made public at this stage. But
Because they have to be leery of signing two drivers for that long, right? There's no way they'd lock into two drivers for until 2024.
I bet they have option, just like they would in any sport. They can option out of it at a certain point, like a one probably 2-year contract with a third-year option if they really want to do
Right,
it.
right.
But it, I just I get why he did it. I get why Ferrari did it. I don't know how Charles feels about this. I could honestly care less because I'm sure he doesn't give a fuck. But Carlos has said so many times, he's given off that vibe. I want to go for this. This is my dream, is to be an F1 world champion. That's it, full stop. There's no caveats to that. It's to be a winner and to hoist the trophy in Abu Dhabi. I don't see how that's gonna fit this like if Ferrari was really thinking they'd find like a easy kick around number 2 like they got out of Barrichello, but instead they're bringing on basically not to sound racially charged, but like a bull in a china shop. He's out for blood. He's been out for blood. He was showed that last year at McLaren.
Absolutely. And I mean, we talked about this a little bit off the air, James, about how, if Ferrari really genuinely wanted a second driver, we brought up Kvyat and we brought up Pierre.
Yes, we did. Those were the other two names in the ring, as it were.
Do you think the fact that Ferrari's so desperate to win a championship is making them just take any driver that they think can actually win, and it's more hurting them in the long run? Well, I guess it depends on how they interact on track, right?
We'll have to wait and see. I think 2021's gonna set the stage pretty much for the next decade of the sport.
Yeah, I can agree with that because that's when regulations are going to change and everything.
And speaking of, I'm looking at the that handy dandy graphic I found on Reddit. And it says here Carlos Sainz, Scuderia Ferrari, all the way till 2022. So he's getting the 2-year deal.
That's a pretty good deal for him, ultimately, if I'm honest. So, with that being said, we all know the news of Ricardo as well at this point, but I really would like to get some opinions on this. We know that Cyril, had already came out and said we don't really have a future with him. And
Cyril came out and said a lot of things this week.
We started on him.
I mean, he doesn't, really, he doesn't hide anything. He puts all
he
of his
doesn't
cards.
mince words at all.
Oh no, but what do we think about this move to McLaren? I mean, personally, I'm going to start off on this one. I think that it's a great move for Daniel. Obviously, Renault, let him down, but if he's going to McLaren next year, McLaren's going to have a Mercedes engine. I would be surprised if they're not up there, and we see a top 4 team setup versus a top 3 team setup like we currently have.
I really like picking up Ricardo for McLaren. They seem like a team. Well, you look at their culture, right? They're a team that can sign a driver like that and give such a boost to the people working there, the team, right? I think it's really the fact that signing a driver like that, they really put faith into their team and their car, and I think they're a team that historically has responded to that. They've kind of risen to the challenge of, all right, well, we've got a driver we know that we can do it, or that can do it, so let's get him a car that can win the championship as well.
I'm gonna have to disagree with you, Kermit.
Really?
If you look at the very, very poor Honda, McLaren, Fernando Alonso thing, that was literally
that was.
Yeah.
Well, we could go into that a little bit. I don't know a whole lot about that.
Just for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Because Eric Boulier rest his career.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What a bummer. That was literally when he was hired at McLaren. word for word almost what you just said now, Kermit. I watched the Grand Prix driver on Amazon. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it. Nate, I'm sure you've seen it. Um, Great documentary, but he literally said on camera, I was hired here to get us a winning race car, and I said, if I'm going to give us a winning race car, we need to have a winning driver. We're going to give him that car, and that driver's got to be Fernando Alonso. And that ended up being the kiss of death in that entire saga, all the way from, what is it, pretty much like 2015 was when he took over there, Nathan?
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
about. End of
that's
Button's
about
career.
accurate. I I mean, I think I've seen Alonso since the days of when he was racing in the Renault, um, with
He
Flavio
was a freak
Briatore,
back
and
then. I've watched those highlights. He's a freak in
I
nature.
mean, absolutely. I
So
think that
supremely
the
talented.
2003 Silverstone Grand Prix went up this week,
Yes.
and it's really funny because you watch and you notice that they're using the old pit straight where we would, you know,
I was going to say
not
that's the run
use
into
anymore.
Cobb's
We're halfway
Corner.
through the lap.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're using that now. In that, and it was just great. But I mean, to see how Alonso drove, to see Jarno Trulli and stuff like that, the people that I watched growing up drive, and of course Michael in the red car, gotta love it. But Fernando has such a feel. He truly does have a talent, and you know, I'll say when he did drive in arguably the worst car on the grid. I mean, honestly, I would say that the Williams was better than the Honda, than the McLaren at that point, and
I mean,
that's saying a lot.
Williams was what, third in 2017 in the constructors,
I
right?
mean,
It was 2016 or
it,
17. There was like unheard of. Like they had Felipe and they had Valtteri. It was 2016,
yeah,
I think. Yeah.
yeah, I think it was 2016
Yeah.
because 2016 is when Nico left,
Right. Right.
and then Valtteri moved over for 2017 season. So yeah, I I totally, you know, I love Fernando. I think he's a very talented driver. I honestly though, I I don't think that it was as toxic as everybody says it was at McLaren. I mean, obviously, he made a lot of really hard comments on Honda, but let's be honest. Honda had been in the sport before. They know what they were getting into.
That's fair.
You know, they should have had so much more research and development done before they hopped in. And I don't think that jumping in at a hybrid era was necessarily beneficial for Honda because they had very few road cars that even used the technology at the time and
But
didn't understand it.
their F1 success has been in the era of the V10. Like straight up naturally aspirated, or did they have turbochargers back in the 80s?
So, so are you saying that when they get a driver that can win championships, they know can win championships, it's not necessarily a team that's inspired by that to like go get that championship and put a car behind them, like when a driver like Ricardo comes in?
Well, allegedly, and this is what the difference has been, was that they got rid of Boulier and they completely changed their organizational structure. They were trying to use like an agile model, which
Mm.
works really well when you're developing a singular product like a phone or a computer. It doesn't really work so well when you've got like three different components trying to work in tandem, being chassis, power plant, and aerodynamics. And they were trying to have like those three. Basically, they basically tried to run it like the way you would on your F1 2019 career mode, but there were so many levels of administrative like hoops they had to jump through. That's like stuff wasn't getting done, things were getting lost. You know, they had to completely change that. And Andreas Seidel came in and like restructured the company with Zach Brown, and they made it a leaner operation, and they made it more transparent versus like the days of Ron Dennis, where it was like the doomsday bunker at the McLaren Technology Center.
But I mean, Ron Dennis, I mean, it has to be said, he accomplished amazing things with Coulthard and you know,
Hakkinen.
Hacken.
Yep.
I mean, he drove that team to success, especially after the Senna Prost era and all of that. And I I don't like Ron Dennis as a person personally. I don't
Most
like
people
him.
don't like Ron Dennis as a person.
I mean, there's very few, right? But you know, he did what was needed. Now, I will say this: I love Zach Brown. I love how he is a problem solver and he wants to get things done immediately, and he doesn't put up with any kind of crap. Um, I really think that he has helped the culture of McLaren a lot. I mean, first thing he does when he gets in there he takes a paint scheme that the team has had for well over a decade, basically, all the way back in the 90s, late 90s, and he throws it out the window and he says, "We're going back to McLaren orange," because he's trying to brighten up the the area. He's trying to brighten up the team because it's been so dark, and it's when you're in that dark place, it was depressing. And then when they started painting their cars orange, you saw the light begin to change. I mean, even Alonso, I think he drove the
Yeah,
2019
2018.
car. He drove the 2018 or the 2019 car in preseason testing, and he said, "This is so much better than what I had."
Fair. So
I
so
mean,
do you think that restructured team responds to a driver like Ricardo? Or, I mean, do you think they had that in signs and they're maybe losing something?
Interesting. I don't know. I
I
can't.
don't know that. How's Lando going to respond to this?
Oh, I think
Yeah,
I,
that's going to be interesting.
business as usual for him. I mean, if you think about it, him, Albon, Russell, all they got to do is keep their fucking heads down and just try to get out of the silly season in one piece.
Seriously.
Like they know, like they're the youngest on the lowest on the totem pole. Their job is to just keep on keeping on and try not to get fired by either Helmut Marko or Toto Wolff.
but can you truly fault George Russell for his position right now? I think he's a good driver. I think he has skill. I think he needs a better car.
That yeah. Well, I mean, if you put anyone in that Williams car, they'd probably also finish P19.
I
I mean,
mean,
Oh yeah, that's
if
what's
you put
so upsetting
Fernando in
about that.
the car,
yeah.
he would say GP2 engine, and it's the same damn engine that's in the Mercedes. But I mean, I think that Ricardo ultimately going to McLaren is good. I think that their relationship between Ricardo and Norris will build. And James, you'll get your bromance back that I know you love. Um,
It's like 50% of
I
the reason
think
I watch this sport.
I think that I definitely think that Lando and Ricardo are great personalities, and I think they're going to tandem each other pretty well. Um, I don't really have any complaints over it.
Yeah, I think their career paths, at least where they're at in their careers, really complement each other pretty well. Like Norris is looking for, I think, a little more of that structure, right? Like a little more of the technicality, because it's still really early in his career. So having someone like that to look to, I think, is probably going to really help him. It just really depends on when their cars get close on the track, how are they going to act around each other?
And Norris is
Absolutely,
he's no schlub. He showed a couple flashes last year when he got into it with the top guys. He didn't back down.
absolutely.
Right, he
So
has the ability to do it.
Indeed.
yeah, I think he has the ability to compete and keep up with that high caliber, no matter what Daniel throws at him. Um, but who does this ultimately affect? Like, I mean, we have a lot of drivers, it looks like here, based off of the spreadsheet that you provided, James. Thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm.
That don't have really any kind of contract for next season.
So I got one name that has not been said, but I'm just gonna say it. Do you know who is like popping champagne right now?
Yeah.
Maybe, but I was gonna say his name rhymes with Nico, and his last name is Hulkenberg because his
Hmm.
seat literally just
Oh.
opened back up, and with the McLaren seat being taken by Ricardo and the trajectory, quote unquote, of Seb's like whole thing. It, I don't see why they don't just take him back.
Yeah, that's a really good. How did I not think of that? Yeah, that's a really good point.
I mean, he's
So
just like
you
he's
think
just chilling. Like he got kicked out of the sport, a pandemic hit, and now he's already back into a job. What luck?
so that would eliminate Vettel from the grid?
I think he's gonna retire after this season.
Oh,
Or
do you see
Mercedes.
Vettel doing the same thing, taking a half season off and coming back for a team like, say, Aston?
I,
Like waiting for the new regs or no?
have you guys heard of the Mercedes? The Mercedes
So
Albon
yeah,
thing.
Toto Wolff actually came out and said he would be foolish not to look at Vettel.
Wow, so Bottas is up then.
I would say
It's
so.
possible.
I
I mean, Valtteri hasn't really done much for the team. He's played a good second fiddle, but I mean, he still hasn't even done that really effectively in the way that Nico did, right? A lot of the times it's Lewis out there owning the road, and he doesn't really have a rear gunner, and he hasn't been there. I I could see Valtteri leaving the sport. I don't think he's ready though. I don't think he wants to.
He's kind of a weird dude. Like, I can get a read on just about everyone on this grid, but I don't know if he's like a cheerful. It's just the finish. It's the finish thing. He's just like he's so
I mean,
like bland. Like
you're
I
gonna
never
tell
know
me
what he's
that
thinking.
You can read Kimmy? Come on now.
But you know exactly what you're getting with Kimmy.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
yeah.
I don't
know,
have a
you know
hard.
what he needs. He tells you. It's yeah.
It's I want he's because Kimmy's like I'm just here to drive, but then
I mean,
Bottas is
nothing was better than
he-
the end of Drive to Survive,
right.
where Kimmy is just sitting there and he's like, "I don't really have to do this. I just got to do it for fun." And
And
it's not about the money.
that's the thing though is that
Yeah.
like you have that, so you're like, okay, Kimmy's Kimmy, got it, Marshawn Lynch of F1. But then you hop over and Valtteri's like in the press, like I've got a secret plan to get ahead of Lewis next year, and it's like, do ya? Because it seems to me he's pulled one over you since 2017. Like there's been no indication that you have that extra 10% that Nico had. Because Nico, unfortunately, is like that's the yardstick you're always going to measure any of Lewis's teammates against. It's him and Fernando. Because he literally pushed Lewis all, like to quote Christian Horner, pushing Lewis Hamilton all the fucking way.
I mean,
You have to be that much of a
Swans,
psycho.
right?
Like you have to be that much of a psycho. I don't think Valtteri's enough of a psycho to do that.
Yeah,
I
no,
mean,
I agree with that.
Valtteri would have to start playing head games, I think, with Lewis, and I don't know how Lewis really plays with head games. Honestly, I know that he didn't do too well, obviously, with Nico, and it was a fight with him. But I mean, I Nico,
Vettel
I think
and oh,
I think it drove Nico so far. I think that's what drove Nico to retirement
I
ultimately.
think he's
Is
actually he stated that publicly that season, despite the championship, he's like the way I felt after that, and thinking about having to do that again in 2017. He's like I couldn't do it. I didn't have it in me to do it again.
yeah. What were you gonna say, Austin?
I just think so. I wonder if Vettel would be a good pair for Hamilton because I think he's looking for that right now. I think right now he doesn't want to like waltz across the eighth finish line, the eighth title finish line, right? Like he wants to be challenged for it, right? I think he wants it more than anything. But if he's winning it like this, I don't think he's as happy as he could be if he fought for it.
So let's take a moment to talk about this. What does a Mercedes team look like with Vettel and Hamilton? I mean, they are both obviously at each other's necks. We've seen it for years now, and they want nothing more than to defeat each other. How does Toto handle that?
Oh, he if Toto's it, hold on, let me phrase this right. I think that when you've got two hungry dogs in your yard and you throw out one bone, you don't get in the middle of that. You let them duke it out over the bone because you might lose a hand in the process. Like, do you get what I'm getting at?
I think so, but do you think that like I think they're both the type of drivers that would let that drive them to higher highs, right? Like wins.
So
Maybe
here's what I'm
maybe
going to say.
that's asking too much of him.
I think Vettel is very passionate these days versus how he was in his Red Bull days, where he was very, thoughtful. I think that it's going to get to him. I think he's going to feel the pressure, and I think that he's going to push Hamilton, and Hamilton would break Vettel
Oof.
mentally, not even on the track. I think he would break Vettel mentally and wouldn't be able to drive to his best, and we would see a lot more of what we've seen at Ferrari.
I
That's a
think
fair assessment.
I'm gonna take the opposite of that position, only because I think that if you get in that Mercedes car and you feel that underneath you, you kind of like. It seems to me that the 2019 Ferrari car had its own set of flaws, and I'm not a technical expert, but they've said as much. They've focused on a low downforce approach philosophy, and it cost them. But with that Mercedes car, it seems to me like Vettel's already a proven winner. You stick him in that seat. Not to say the Ferrari wasn't a winning car, but you put him in an environment like that where he doesn't feel like he's being like edged out by Charles. Like he's like, because I think the thing was is the pressure of him not fulfilling that dream of being like Schumacher. No matter how bad he told himself it's what he still wanted, after a certain point, he start to feel you could feel it slipping away through his fingers, and when he's looking at this season, he's probably thinking to himself like, it's just not going to happen. The dream's dead. So
And I mean, that's kind of what happened with him at Red Bull, wouldn't you say, with Ricardo?
that I did not watch the 2014 season, but that to my understanding, he basically got trounced.
Absolutely. I mean, Ricardo came into the team and he outperformed him, and he struggled. And I've said this many times before. I've said it actually, I believe, on our Division One races. I believe we were talking about Chandler Seda, one of our F1 drivers, fantastic guy. But ultimately, I think we were talking about how it he struggles much like Seb does in traffic, and that was really what drove Seb away from Red Bull because the car wasn't able to perform in traffic. But now, even at the Scuderia, we've seen the same exact thing.
Brazil comes to mind.
Absolutely. Um, but I really think that, seeing them both at the same place in Mercedes, it's going to be a tough one. It would definitely be fun to watch, though.
Okay, let me ask you this. So
Mhm.
Sebastian Vettel back to Red Bull Racing. Christian Horner's admitted he is one of his favorite drivers.
You're going to get rid of Alex Albon, though?
Well,
I think Helmut Marko actually came out on record and said they couldn't afford him.
oh,
I mean,
Vettel?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's fair.
yeah. They pretty much straight up said like we have a stable of drivers that we don't have to pay world championship money to anymore.
And you're right. I think they're really trying to build that team around Verstappen. He's shown he can do it, and their car is showing more and more promise every year. So I think, yeah, you're probably right. Now is not the right time for them to sign a driver like Vettel, I don't think.
so then let's get real here. Is there any team left in the field other than Mercedes that can afford Seb?
This is another dumb thought I had today. Um, so let's pretend for a moment Giovinazzi just shits the bed this year. How funny would it be if Alfa Romeo just becomes the retirement home of Ferrari drivers? Like
Alpha retire.
just Inspector Seb and Dr. Watson just kicking it in Switzerland. Like, oh, we'll
my
race. We don't have to worry about wins. We get to enjoy ourselves this way. Like,
Playing games with like AlphaTauri and Renault, just
yeah,
like
like
I mean,
like we're back here.
let's get real. What is Alpha genuinely, in the sport for other than advertisement?
that's a. I don't know. I don't
You
know.
know, I mean, they're obviously. I don't feel like they're genuinely trying to compete for the upper half of the grid. I don't feel like they have a drive to be there. I feel like the team is literally there as either a test and development team for Ferrari,
Which it kind of
or
is in a sense because they
yeah,
own that. They own one of the seats outright.
yeah, or just for advertisement.
Well,
Well, so right, so that begs the question, like, what teams are actually gonna stay in this, right? What are their motives for being in the sport?
and it's murky as hell with this economic downturn we're in right
Ugh.
now.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure, and I think you're 100% right here. And thank you for moving us on to our next topic of who is going to stay after the rule change, and who's going to be able to continue to compete as far as the teams. I'm going to pull us back to a slightly different story though, because it does relate to this. Um, Austin, I'm not sure if you had heard about this, but me and James have talked about it in the past. Did you hear what Ralph Schumacher's advice was to Williams?
No, I had not heard.
So Ralph Schumacher, if you don't know, obviously it's Michael's older brother. He used to race at Williams back in the day when it was Williams BMW or BMW. Yeah, it was Williams BMW. So Ralph actually stated that they should be more like Haas, be a customer team, stop being a constructor. And, that's a very interesting point here because I feel like for some of these different teams, what they're going to have to do is stop being constructors.
So, which I stewed on this earlier. I don't see how Williams makes it through this entire pandemic and doesn't just become a subsidiary of some larger organization. I think for sure they're going to stay in the sport, but they're not going to be like the independent team they've always been.
Yeah, I don't see how it can continue. I mean, unless, yeah.
I mean, they need like a silver bullet of results this year to not finish 10th. And there really was no indication in testing that they were going to be that far up the grid, right?
Like perfect year. It's a half season to test a guinea pig like Tracing Point.
Yeah, shit. they're actually. I think they're one of the most fascinating. What's it gonna be like in the future teams because they're gonna have that like big ass brand behind them. They got Stroll coming in, Daddy Warbucks in it up in that joint, and they've got like Checo, who's a consistent driver.
Yep, they're my dark horse. If there's one team that we're not expecting to like do really well, I think it'll be them. And not just because they copied the car, but I think you're right. They have a lot of momentum around them. And sorry, I don't mean to say they copied the car exactly. Obviously, they did a lot of work and put a lot of thought into what the car actually had to be. And I'm sure they've made their own tweaks to it. But it goes down to the argument of being a constructor team or being a customer team.
Completely.
So I'm going to bring something up here, and I'm going to bring kind of an old guard. All right, we're going to talk about Papa Hewitt here for a moment. So I was actually discussing this with him, and his outlook on what Ralph Schumacher had to say, and he thinks that more teams should be like Haas and Racing Point. He thinks that more teams should purchase other cars' components to build their car and to make their car.
It's way more sustainable.
Like,
so I mean, that's how he feels because ultimately, we've seen so many teams shuffle through. I mean, at least since I've been watching, I've seen so many teams come and go and leave. Does anybody remember the Orange Arrows?
No.
I mean, the Orange Arrows racing team used to be part of it. Jordan Racing, the old yellow Ford powered, V10s back in the day and V12s. I mean,
was a
these
flash in the pan.
Jaguar.
Yeah.
Oh, that
I
was
mean,
Gunther's first posting.
I mean, one of the best liveries, in my opinion, on a Formula One car had to be Jaguar back in the day. It just looked great. And Eddie Irvine with his leopard or Jaguar print helmet on top. I mean, old school. But we've seen so many teams come and go. And something that a lot of people forget is the field used to be 22 cars. We're down.
There is an alleged 11th team.
I did hear about that.
The
So
Chinese,
if there's an alleged,
or is it Southeast Asia? It was one of the two. I couldn't think of it exactly. But
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I haven't heard anything about the alleged team. Do we have a timeline? Do we know when they're supposed to come?
Allegedly.
2022, I think.
Yeah. Austin, I think you might have more info on it than I do.
Let me see. One sec.
So while Austin's looking that up, let's see. What were we? We had Williams. We're talking Racing Point turning Aston Martin. I mean, the one team I'm sincerely worried about because their owner looks like a bit of a curmudgeon and it's not profitable for him anymore. I think Haas might just evaporate.
Yeah, I think that they really have to show some results this year and definitely be able to beat Renault. But I think Racing Point is going to be the question mark if they can.
I worry about Renault too, actually, just from a funding standpoint, because they're getting a pretty fat check from the French people to go out and try and do this thing to revive like the glory days of Renault from the early 2000s. But did you see Cyril's comments today?
No, I have not.
He just like keeps digging himself deeper and deeper into this like hole of like empty promises. He came out and straight up said like, well, we want to put the funding into the car for 2021, but then the regulation pushed to 2022. So he's like already playing like this excuse game of, well, we had this plan, But you see this guy ate a bat in China, so now we're just gonna keep pushing this plan back until it finally breaks my way. But they've thrown a lot of money at the problem, and they haven't really turned it around.
I mean, obviously, right? They hired Ricardo.
For
and
a king's ransom, I might add. That's the worst deal in the history of trade deals ever. My God.
and I mean, they blame Ricardo for it. I
Yeah.
feel like they have a lot of blame on Ricardo for not being able to do what they can with the car, and I don't really understand it. Austin, have you found any news for us?
I have not, unfortunately. So as of right now, it is a relatively unsubstantiated rumor that there will be another team joining. That could have very much been before this whole COVID thing hit.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Money's gonna
Well,
be
if you
real
guys,
tight.
Right.
absolutely, if you guys haven't been following the Formula One Instagram, I think it's time that you go join it. They recently have been doing a lot of polls and different voting that's been going on, and you know, we have a poll that's recently finished and concluded. I believe it was either today or yesterday for the most influential figure in Formula One history. And it ended up actually being Michael Schumacher. I'm going to save my opinion to last. James, I'm going to have you kick this one off.
Well, two things. First off, this just goes to prove that even with Max Verstappen's Orange Army, the Tifosi are still the biggest dicks in Formula One.
That's rude. I take offense.
I mean,
Wow.
dick as in like penis, not dick as in assholes.
Okay, that's fair.
Because like that, they literally that is just the most beautiful example of this is why we don't let the fans do it, because nostalgia is a very powerful thing. And this poll went to prove that despite all these other people who arguably were influential to like the future of the sport, the development of, what it became now and helping to grow the brands and all this stuff. I'm a business person, so I always err on that side. But a guy who like arguably was a fantastic competitor, he was the greatest of this last two generations. Like he's shown his stuff. But like that doesn't mean you're influential. And to say that he was more influential than Bernie Ecclestone, that was just like a bridge too far for me.
So I'm gonna argue for Michael right now.
Go ahead. Well, Austin, did you see this?
I did. Yeah, I did see that poll. And again, it's a thing where I wasn't around in the era, but it seems like it kind of depends on how you define influential, right? If you talk about how this sport was shaped over the course of many, many years, I think, other names pop up towards the top of the list.
Totally.
Braun, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Like people that have really shaped, Nicky Lauda, people that have shaped teams that have where people go. Like Schumacher, he doesn't really seem to be involved, really,
He
right?
wasn't a catalyst.
Right.
Yeah. But Nathan.
So here's what I'm going to do for you guys. I'm going to read off the entire starting list that they posted.
Go ahead.
First, we're going to start with drivers. We have Sir Jackie Stewart,
Mhm.
Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Fangio, Michael Schumacher, Nicky Lauda, Senna, and Jack Brabham. Okay?
Mhm.
The game changers, we have Bernie Ecclestone. We've got Ross Braun. We've got Max Mosley, Murray Walker, Helmut Marko, and a few others that honestly aren't very influential at all, in my opinion. Team bosses. We have Enzo Ferrari, Flavio Briatore, Colin Chapman, Sir Frank Williams, Ron Dennis, Christian Horner, Jean Todt, and Toto Wolff. And then for investors, I mean, none of these really ended up producing anything anyways, and they're not anybody that I would actually suggest anyways. I think that we've named everybody here out of this list that would actually be influential. And I know that a lot of you, I know that you guys are newer to the sport, and let me just give you a little bit of history about what Michael did and how Michael approached driving completely differently than any other driver of his era. Michael would constantly, when he got out of the car after doing a test run or after doing a qualifying run, he would immediately get his blood sampled
What?
and figure out what his body was doing while he was,
What?
driving and figure out what his oxygen levels were and everything.
This is like something that
Michael
Nike would do now.
Michael went to a fitness level that no other driver had before. You look at Nigel Mansell. I mean, the guy wasn't fit at all
He had a
compared to
yeah,
today's
he had a
standards.
big
Who
ass
said?
dick.
Someone said that recently. Yeah, that it's the difference is fitness, right?
And it's a huge fitness. And Michael was the innovator of this. Michael was the person who he would figure out what his heart rate was while he was driving the car the second he got back in the pits, so he could match his heart rate while he was working out to simulate the same exact effect on his body. So that's where Michael really has influenced the sport in, not only his driving style, not only obviously many of our current field grew up watching him, but he really influenced the sport in the way of fit, and that's really where I can defend Michael in how he did things. And he was also he was really kind of like Nikki in a sense, very involved in the car and knew various different things. Um, that's where I'm going to defend Michael. I'll let you guys give your opinions now.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and those are very valid points. I don't want to invalidate those points because they are very important things to say. Like he changed the way people like the athletes approached their craft. But to me, that's not if you're talking about influencing the entire realm or this entire this thing this crazy thing that is Grand Prix driving. He that was like it's only like one facet of this very complex sport.
Mhm.
If you think about it, that had a very big effect to the drivers. But if you look at the sport as a whole, drivers who have made a bigger difference, like Jackie Stewart was like out there trying to save lives in the '60s, like pushing for safety, like that wasn't just like he changed the way we compete. He made it so we could compete without dying. Like, really, like instead of putting the cart before the horse, he was like, let's do this, but we should be able to do this, not have to risk like, completely put everything on the line that badly every time. I mean, he skipped his last race because of was it Cervera who passed, or I forgot. I watched it in that one documentary on Amazon, but it, it just seems to me like influencing the drivers is one thing, but if you look at the entire sphere of Formula One, it seems to me like there's just a lot of other names that you threw out there that have had a much bigger impact on the entire, furthering and development of the sport.
Absolutely. Austin, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with James. I think there's a lot of names that come up on that list that are probably higher than his if you're looking at the sport overall. I want to say that, well, I want to ask, was that poll that they did, were users or fans able to submit suggestions?
I actually don't know. That's a great
So
question.
yeah, it was actually a poll. This was a poll from the fans. It started with this major list and then it went down.
Oh, but they
Oh, I
they
see.
set the
So
seating.
Yeah.
I see. So it seems like it's a list heavily skewed towards the modern era, like Lewis Hamilton. Like I get it, but he hasn't really. I don't know, because I think if you think Michael's at the top, the only other driver you can compare his direct qualities to is really Lewis Hamilton. And would I say he has been the most influential figure in F1 history? Certainly not yet. And if he were to leave the sport and not really, be hands-on in a team, then I think he'd probably take himself out of contention for that. Braun, Helmut Marko, I think come up on that list.
Yeah,
Williams, of course, right?
for
I
sure.
think all those names are in the discussion over F1 history.
I think that somebody very important was left out of this list, and it's Jim Clark.
Yeah,
Mm.
There's nothing about Jim Clark on this list, and I mean, I'm not saying he was influential, but
he's got a
he
way bigger status than Max Verstappen in the
he
sport.
changed
Yeah.
his presence, and he changed how drivers drove, much like Michael did. He changed how drivers perceived the sport. And he's a crazy madman. He's doing 5 or 6 different series all at the same time. But I'm going to bring this into who I ultimately think should have won this, no matter how much of a Michael Schumacher fan I am, no matter how many Michael Schumacher hats are hanging on the wall behind me from his podiums and championships. It's ultimately going to be this. I think that Bernie Ecclestone is the number one most influential man in Formula One history because the simple fact he made it attainable. He made the sport attainable to everybody by purchasing the media rights and owning the media rights to what has ultimately become a global phenomenon.
You're right. Look at the way coverage is transformed.
I mean, there's nothing you can do really you can't look at it any other way. And how he ran the business, I know that James, you as a businessman, obviously, and owning part of PPR here, you definitely can see how he really transformed the sport. And even with your, you know how he handled his dealings with racetracks and who was going to be on the calendar and who wasn't.
Yeah, I've always kind of put it to people this way. It's like, some kids grow up wanting to be like Kobe or Tiger Woods or like that kind of thing, but the the way like that guy, like he just had so much foresight during that 1976 season to be like, wait, you're telling me we've got like a title decider happening in this exotic location in the rain? Like, they were gonna call the race, and he's in there like, we're running this shit. I already sold the TV rights, guys. If you don't do this, you all owe me a like. He basically just put his dick on the table and said, we got to do this. And that was the day. Like, this didn't just become some kooky European pastime of like rich playboys and trust fund kids. He put it on a pedestal and said, no, this is not just something rich kids do in Monaco once a year. This is a global phenomena being fought out by gladiators on the world stage. Like traveling to Brazil and to Spain and to Italy. Like it's so exotic, and he brought that into people's homes for the first time. For the first time, it wasn't just like, oh yeah, like they run that Le Mans race. I think Ford won it a couple times, but Ferrari usually wins it. But now they're like, wait, by the way, here's all the personalities and here's all like the drama of the sport, and it just built on itself into the 80s with the Prost and Senna thing, and
Mhm.
all the way up until he sold it his stock essentially to Liberty. He had been Machiavellianly controlling everything to keep the sport this fascinating and glitzy and glamorous and sexy thing. He did it. He saw like the potential all the way back in the pouring fucking rain at the Fuji racetrack.
Absolutely. Austin, final thoughts before we close out here.
Final thoughts on best driver, Daniel Ricciardo, no question.
Best driver. I like how you pull in your own topic here when we're talking about influential drivers. Come on, Austin.
No, it's
Influential people.
sorry. Yeah, it's I just got him on my mind a lot. I think about him a lot.
I do
But
have
I
one
do
too.
have one closing thought. It's probably a good lighthearted COVID story here.
Sure.
It'll be a quick one. So everything's closed because of COVID. You gotta go in, you gotta pick up your food, you gotta leave. So I ordered it online the other day from a local restaurant. I go in to pick up my food and I tell the lady my name. I say, my name's Austin. I'm here to pick up my food. She looks through what she has on the counter, doesn't see anything related to um, my name. And then she asks, so Kermit maybe? I'm like, oh my God, you're kidding.
Oh, when the gamer tag haunts you, as James well knows, I actually have my gamer tag as my vanity plate on my car.
Awesome.
So yeah, he got a little jealous over that. But
True epic
guys,
gamer fashion.
you have most definitely wasted another hour here listening to some secondhand news and getting our opinions over the current world and situations in F1. Um, as always, this has been brought to you by PPR Esports. You can check us out at ppresports.com. Feel free to join the Discord additionally. We do have a charity event coming up June 27th, the 12 Hours of Silverstone. That is to aid the Huntington's Disease Association. Please feel free to donate. We will be giving away some prizes, and it does get you a couple raffle tickets. Other than that, As always, this has been the Secondhand News Crew here at PPR. I want to thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.